This was an incredible opportunity for me to be able to talk to you today about an issue that I think may be an obstacle, but also an opportunity of interbranch and public trust and confidence relations. And you'll find out through my presentation that I'm kind of one of those people who likes alliteration. And onus isn't a word that probably gets used a lot, but it was the only O word I could think of. Okay, so let me make sure. Is the red advance, folks? Okay. There you go. As you may know, coming from Virginia, we're steeped in the history, and I just wanted to mention generally, after our speaker this morning talked about some of the basic principles of the founding generation. And how many of you saw the John Adams series? Did a lot of you see the John Adams series? I actually teach a class on separation of powers, inherent powers, and checks and balances in a fellowship program similar to your leadership program. It's called the Institute for Court Management, Court Executive Development Program. And we spend a lot of time looking at the Federalist Papers, and I just want to mention very quickly, not because of the issue about a strong central government or states' rights, but because it is an incredible collection of discussions about how you establish a government, how you look at what some of the challenges, the obstacles are, and that you think about what can you do to solve those problems. And so when they were crafting these foundations, three men set out to convince the citizens of New York to vote for the new Constitution. Some of us in the room were at a dinner where Chief Justice Roberts spoke last fall, and he said, well, if the Articles of Confederation hadn't been changed, all of you would be here at the Supreme Court, but I'm not sure where Justice Ginsburg and I would be. And I think that we sometimes don't recall that there was over a 10-year period from the Revolutionary War and the Articles of Confederation till the adoption of the Constitution. And so when we look around, and I know you have an international committee, the National Center is working in places like Kosovo and Afghanistan and Lebanon, 10 years to accomplish that in the U.S. And we're looking at 12, 24, 18 months in countries that had no prior experience with any kind of representative republic. And so these three men were Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. I just want to mention real quickly that Jay was the first Chief Justice, and from the day of his nomination to his confirmation was 2 days to the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't know that we'll ever see that again. He also served as the governor of New York. In fact, Washington had sent him to Paris to participate in some of the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, specifically on some economic development issues and some issues about water rights, fishing, and that kind of thing. And while he was there representing the U.S., the citizens of New York elected him governor, and he had to resign from the U.S. Supreme Court to come home to serve in that capacity. So it's just an incredible group of people that looked at kind of what are those values, what have we learned, as you heard this morning, from the experiences of the different colonies that we wanted to make sure were embedded into a constitution. And so there were about 85 of these, what were really letters to the editor. And I really read portions of the Federalist Papers once a year. And you can get them now in plain language, you know, Federalist Papers for Dummies. You know, you can find it at Barnes & Noble. But it talks about the legislature and the responsibilities of the legislature and the challenges of the legislature. It talks about the executive branch, and it talks about the judiciary. And Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 made this observation about salaries and about compensation for public officials, that what might be adequate today might in half a century become inadequate. Sounds like cost of living adjustments, doesn't it? And so there actually were some discussions in the Federalist Papers about salary setting and how that would happen and how it needed to be regularly reviewed. And so they wrote these series of articles under the pseudonym of Publius. And that was really from a Roman jurist who was, you know, kind of the voice of the people. Also, Alexander Hamilton knew that he wasn't exactly, you know, the most popular of the various founders, and so he wanted the support of two other gentlemen writing with him. But in addition to looking at interbranch relations, they also talked about judicial review. This wasn't something that just came out of Marbury versus Madison. They looked at the examples from other states, and frankly, Pennsylvania, in their state constitution, had a process where it was basically something like a constitutional convention that convened to look at judicial review. And there had been some problems with that. So they were saying, well, this, you know, this doesn't seem to work. So in Federalist 78, Hamilton discusses that there need to be these adjustments. But I want to talk today, starting with some basic truths about salary setting for public officials. And the first is that appreciation for the demands of public service is not part of a voter's DNA. There has to be a constant education about the responsibilities, about the stress, about just really the challenges of public service. Also, nobody likes to give themselves a pat on the back, but everybody needs one. And I think just as individuals, it's very difficult for us to stand up and say, you know, I really deserve that. Or I really did a good job. I was able to build a coalition and get support for this bill that had been an issue that was out there for a long time. And finally, we have to remind ourselves that every dollar is a public dollar. I mean, the National Center for State Courts is a private nonprofit corporation, and we share a campus with William & Mary Law School in Williamsburg. But we're a privately funded institution. We're not part of William & Mary, which is a public institution. And so the students at the law school like to cut through our buildings. I mean, literally in one door and out the other rather than walking around. And you know, we have different groups meeting there, and from time to time we'll put up a sign, you know, please don't disturb or go around. And we had one young man come in and was just attacking the receptionist, that his father was in the legislature and this was a public building and his taxpayer dollars went to pay for this building and we couldn't prevent him from walking through it. So I'm sure all of you in your careers sometime or another have had someone tell you that they pay your salary. And so I think part of those truths that we have to remind ourselves of is every dollar is a public dollar. And like the founders, we have to construct a more perfect process. While they were looking at a more perfect union and what were the lessons they could learn from the various constitutions and the Articles of Confederation, we have to look at what are the challenges of the past and what are some examples that we can use to move forward. So I want to talk just a minute about the problems. The problem with setting salaries for public officials is that we want to attract, but we also want to maintain qualified citizens to public service. That's very difficult to do, especially in states that are term limited, especially in states where judges are elected and they have to get second mortgages on their homes in order to run for an office that pays less than the value of their homes, and that it's no longer a part-time position. You know, I think even when we look back to the founding generation, there was this idea that you came and you served for, you know, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then you went back to the farm, or you went back to your mercantile, or you went back to your former life. And while Madison, one of Madison's big issues in writing the Federalist were how do you control special interests? He calls them factions. And one of the reasons that he thought that they wouldn't be a problem in the future is because never before had a republic been successful that was of the geographic size of the then United States, which were the first first 13 colonies, right? And so that geographic separation would prevent special interests from being able to communicate. What in the world would he do if he walked in and somebody talked about a blog? I mean, those were issues that they considered. That I think what we can take from the Federalist Papers and the founding generation is how do we take that decision-making model and apply it to these challenges. The Virginia Constitution was Madison's roadmap when he wrote the federal Constitution. So today I'm going to be talking about at least one model that we can consider as a similar roadmap. And that's the Washington Citizens Commission on Salaries for Elected Officials. And this is their mission. We evaluate the position, the voters evaluate performance. And I think for those of us who have served in public office, that's a distinction that has to be reinforced to the public, that somehow what the position should be paid is separate from whether or not you think your locally elected official was doing a good job. So a roadmap for setting salaries of public office is similar to those roadmaps that the founders were looking at from the local state constitution. So how can we revise some of the concepts that I'll be talking about that were used in this particular model for your state? Or how can you rework it to look at what are some of the concepts and things that might work and others that won't? So, like I said, the challenge is separating the position for the performance, but we need to address these challenges before we can talk about the alternative. So, the two most obvious reasons that the citizens of Washington established a Citizens Commission was to remove public considerations from the salary setting process as much as possible, and to establish proper compensation, proper salaries for the positions. So the position first, and how do you separate that person and that performance from the position? So I just wanted to take a minute to talk about kind of those issues that are the politics that create the challenges in problem setting. And I think for the public, it's really looked as being self-serving. You know, how do we ensure that a vote to increase money is not just for personal gain? We can look to the Federalist Papers again for some ideas. I mean, all of us have heard a quote from one of the Federalist Papers that said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But there are several of the Federalist Papers that talk about the challenges of harnessing just human nature for public good. And so I think we can think about that as a value in looking at different alternative ways of establishing salary setting processes for public office. Also, there's this issue of intimidation. You know, well, I've got to face election, so, you know, if I vote for this, it's going to look, you know, what implications is that going to have if I have an opponent? You know, is that something that is going to constantly be the sound bite rather than getting down to some of the policy? And then manipulation. I would point to the recent situation in New York with judges' salaries. For some of you who may not be familiar with that, judges in the state of New York have not had a salary increase for 12 years, while state and merit position employees, the governor and the legislature during the same period of time have had several. And so what's happened there is one party's afraid that they may lose control of one of the houses, and the other party is trying to force the issue, and nobody wants to vote for salaries during a presidential election year. So one party tied this increase in judicial elections to an increase for legislators. You see what I mean? Because they knew the other house wasn't going to vote to give themselves a salary raise. So there's that issue in our current process for manipulation. So how do we craft a system that would control for that? And finally, power. You know, we talked about checks and balances, and everybody, for some reason, thinks an appropriate check and balance on the judiciary's decisional authority is to hold judicial salaries hostage. And so what can we do about that, just that whole power dynamic? So one of the ways that we can talk about separating politics from salary setting is to look at what Madison and the Federalists call parchment barriers. You know, what are these things that are just written on paper but don't actually happen? And some of you may know that separation of powers as a phrase does not appear once in the federal Constitution. But what they did was write it into the actual articles that establish the authority of the three branches of government. So I want to use the Washington model to talk about these three components. And first off, I'm going to talk about just the authority. In Washington State, there was a constitutional amendment. And I think a lot of people say, oh my gosh, constitutional amendment never happened in my state. While I was in Washington State, within a 20-year span, there were 5 constitutional amendments passed to reform the judicial branch of government in some way. That's the appropriate way to deal with what sometimes we see as an imbalance in power. And I think public participation was key. The legislature, when we first started talking about this alternative, was saying, well, wait a minute, I don't want to be viewed as voting for this model. And we said, well, wait a minute, you don't have to say you're voting for it. You can say that you think it's an important issue that the people should have a direct involvement in making a decision about. So that the legislators' vote, put it on the ballot, was merely a vote to allow for public participation in making that decision. And then the legislature, so the Constitution was very general. You know, we're going to establish a commission that will be called the Washington Commission on Salaries for Elected Officials, but the enabling legislation was very specific about that process, about how that would work, about who the members were, and how it would operate. And here is an excerpt of the constitutional amendment. The salaries for members of the legislature, elected officials of the of the executive branch, and that was the governor, the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, all those superintendent of public instruction. I mean, you know, dog catchers are elected in Washington State. And about 479 officials, but because most of them are judges, all the judges of all levels of court, except for municipal court judges in Washington's salaries, are set by this commission. So that's 4 court levels in Washington State. It also said that it would be independent. So it was more of a check and balance on the salary setting opportunity, and it was directed by law to that purpose. It passed by over 60% of the vote in the year that it was on the ballot. And the Constitution still prohibited reduction of salaries during the term of a public official's office, but there was, and it didn't change the authority that if a public official was convicted of a felony, that they would lose their pension, that they would lose their salary. But it established in a very general way that there would be a citizens commission. So let's look at the enabling legislation. It basically established that the salaries would be based on realistic standards according to the duties of office. It reinforces that the position and the authority was what was important, not the incumbent. It also talked about the relationship of salaries to that position. And how do you attract the most qualified citizens to service? But it did not establish any authority over pensions or benefits. It was merely the salaries. So they could realign the base, whatever the base pays. They could grant a general wage adjustment, a cost of living, and they could make no change at all. So this was the authority behind this particular model. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the members, because this is where I think the public's trust and confidence in try of overcoming one of those barriers of it looking like it was self-serving, and that's what this model was trying to adopt. Compensation, the members are unpaid. There are 16 members, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about how those and who they are. The governor appoints based on nominations from the President of the Senate and Speaker of the House. And then there is a residency and a conflict of interest provision. But the composition was basically a check and balance on power to set compensation. So let's talk about the members, because I think this is definitely where this issue about saying what are your values and how do you balance them. Of the 16 members, 9 are pulled from the rolls of registered voters at random by the Secretary of State from the 9 congressional districts. I mean, we all just kind of take a pause, right? I have to tell you, in the 20 years that I attended every public hearing that this commission was required to have, no less than 4 a year, it was the citizens on those commissions who took that job and took that responsibility so seriously. And you're talking about people from a single mom who was drawing welfare to a pastor of a small church in Bellingham up on the Canadian border, to a small business owner of an occult shop in Olympia, Washington. I mean, you name it, they were on this commission. It really reinforced my trust in the voting public by seeing how seriously these people took that job. And so the other 7 members, as I mentioned, were jointly nominated by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, but they had some requirements that they had to fill. Once again, that whole check and balance. And they had to have personnel management experience. So everybody, all 7 of them had to have that. And they had to have 5 from private institutions of higher learning, from business, a professional management position, the law, and organized labor. Then the other 2, one had to be the chair of the state personnel board, the merit system, the civil service system, and one was nominated by the presidents of the 4-year institutions of higher education in the state. And then they collectively voted to designate their chair. But the Citizens Commission, as you see, wasn't just a title in the Constitution. It actually was and is a commission of citizens. I mentioned the residency and conflict of interest requirement. The members have to be a resident of the state, and they may not be a state official, a public employee, or a lobbyist, or an immediate family member of a lobbyist. I would have to say that there was an AG's opinion on this issue of a immediate family member. I remember that African-American lawyer from Seattle was the legal representative, Gary Gayton, excellent guy, and he was going to start, they were limited to 2 terms. And Gary was on his 2nd term, and someone raised the fact that he had a brother who worked for an insurance company in Seattle who actually went down and testified before the legislature. And so was that a lobbyist? And rather than have it reflect on the commission, he resigned. But these requirements were taken very seriously. And so the 7 legislative appointments, as I mentioned, had to have personnel management experience. So let's talk about the process. How does it actually work? They have to establish salaries to attract citizens of the highest quality by looking at what's the proper salary, what are the realistic standards, and how do you pay according to office. So they have a 2-year salary schedule. The budget in Washington State is a biennial budget. And so in the year that they have to establish the salaries, they get together in January, and they have to have public hearings. Starting in January, there can be no fewer than 4. And so I'd like to just mention how that actually happens. As you can imagine, when they first set up business, there weren't any administrative codes, there weren't any internal policies or procedures. In fact, my office took the responsibility of getting the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House and the governor and everybody together to kind of say, okay, over breakfast in the chief's chambers, you know, what do we need to do to make this a reality? And so they started by holding these public hearings. And then, maybe after 6 years or so of a rotation, there was a question raised about when did they have to make their recommendations. Because the public said, well, if there's no recommendation when they go out and hold this public hearing, how do we know what we're responding to? So what they decided to do was to hold a public hearing in Olympia, which is the state capital. They usually have representatives from all the various public positions come, say with, you know, what they think is an appropriate salary or an appropriate salary adjustment, and then they issue what is a preliminary recommendation. And that's what then they use to hold the public hearings around the state. And as I said, it's for all three branches of government. So they adopt a 2-year schedule, and then they hold public hearings. They also have a website. If you're interested, you can go to their website. And Washington has a public television, kind of like a Washington C-SPAN called TVW. And a lot of their public hearings are shown on TVW. I remember the year that Ross Perot ran for president. Every public hearing in the state was packed, not because salaries were an issue, but because there was such a grassroots swell of populism in the state that year. Any opportunity that people had to come in and talk about how they thought government was performing. The reason I recall it is because we had never before had to have state patrol security at any of these public hearings. And it was really amazing because the chair very quietly but very respectfully reminded people of what the role and authority of this commission was. And it wasn't to talk about the performance of the legislature or the performance of the insurance commissioner or the performance of the Chief Justice. It was to talk independently about those positions. And you can imagine the impact when a pastor from a small evangelical church in Bellingham is who gets quoted on the front page of the Seattle Times about salaries, or the retired military officer from, from the naval base is talking about salaries rather than the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader or the Chief Justice. Those were the voice and are the voice of the Citizens Commission. So they have to file their final recommendation with the Secretary of State no later than the first Monday in June. And this is the issue. It automatically becomes law 90 days later unless there is a public referendum. There have been 2 attempts, the first in '87 when the commission was first adopted, and another in '97, neither of which were ever filed with the Secretary of State for lack of a number of signatures, required signatures. And I really credit that to the fact that the citizens who served on this commission have embraced the process and the integrity and the transparency of it in such a way that the public has developed some confidence in the way that the process works. Staffing, at first it was part-time. They had a part-time person, and the office was just established for 6 months. The governor usually found a place to put this position with a telephone, somebody that could answer the phone. But starting in 1999, they now have 2 full-time positions because they think it's important that throughout the year, if people have questions about salaries, that they're able to answer, that they're able to develop a body of information that I'll talk about in a minute. And they have a website. They've also had to adopt some administrative code called the Washington Administrative Code in Washington State. And they've developed some internal policies and procedures that they didn't have in the early days that are now available on the website. And so the goals were to have a fair and equitable salary, but to also, increase the public's confidence in the process. And so they've really made that a reality. They advertise these public hearings. They go on local talk radio to announce it, to explain the process, and they invite local leaders to come and talk about the issues. And those people that you hear on public radio aren't usually the appointees of the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House. It's usually these appointed or selected citizens. And so some of the operating principles that they've adopted over time is to maintain parity. Parity with who? Well, really with those civil service positions. How many of us are aware that you begin to have these cabinet positions or the heads of some of the executive agencies, or even for the judiciary, the deans of the public law schools or the law school professors make $75,000 more than the Chief Justice, or $100,000 more than the governor, or $80,000 more than a member of the legislature. And so they really wanted to look at parity with these positions that were really under the supervision of legislative leaders and the heads of the judicial and executive branches. And they also adopted, I think because they started thinking about this in a way that you do with personnel management, that it's better to have small increments regularly than droughts with double-digit increases. It's better for public perception, and it helps the legislature for budgetary planning. So all of a sudden you're not looking at a 50%, 20%, 30% increase for a position. So what's kind of the methodology they use? They've used consultants. They've looked at national and local comparisons. And I wanted to talk a minute about these knowledge, skills, and abilities, mental demands, and accountability. We talked about national comparisons, and I know the Council of State Government, certainly the National Center for State Courts. If you go to our website, there's a judicial salary click on, and you can find out the latest salaries for every court in the nation. We do normalize those in order to balance the cost of living, say, in New York versus Rhode Island versus Colorado versus Mississippi. And that's based on basically the cost of living index. And so I think there is a lot of information in looking at, so for the judicial branch, as I mentioned, kind of looking at publicly paid lawyers, not just, what, the managing partner of the biggest firm in Seattle, for instance, makes, but what's the public paying for a position with similar authority. And then also looking at what county officials are making, what municipal commissioners are making in the legislative and executive branches. But knowledge, skills, and abilities really measure what a person has to know to be able to do the job. For instance, legislators and judges, that would be kind of a body of knowledge, the laws, the complexity of the issues that come before you. And then the mental demands are mostly your analytical skills. How do you figure things out? The panel this morning was talking about kind of this collegiality of the responsibility to develop these coalitions. Well, the legislature might rank higher in the ability to do that versus someone in the executive branch who just has to manage health care or just has to manage education versus the legislature who has to be able to see out over all those types of responsibilities. And then accountability. How are you held accountable for the consequences or the actions? And it really measures more of that individual contribution versus the contribution of the body as a whole. So I want to give you some examples. The legislature, for instance, emphasizes, as I said, that broad knowledge that you have to have over a variety of complex issues and your ability to respond to constituents. That's much more a responsibility of the legislative branch of government than, say, the judiciary. But looking at the judiciary, it requires a professional degree in Washington State. There has to be an individual ability to understand not only the criminal law, but the civil law as well, and be able to apply that. Family law, the death penalty, the level of the impact of the individual decisions that have to be made. And in the executive branch, it's kind of more targeted. Like you have to have a broader expertise for managing large staff groups, unlike the judiciary or the legislature, unless you're a committee chair. But, when you look at the Department of Health and Human Services, several thousand employees. So that's the way that this methodology has worked. So I guess you want to say, so what? So what's happened? I want to show you just briefly, and because I know we've got some attorney generals and some secretary of states, I've added to these. But this is a comparison of the salaries in 1987 versus the ones that have been approved through 2008. Using these principles of small increments and adjusting the salaries for the authority. One that's very interesting to me is after they started looking at these knowledge, skills, and abilities, is they determined that legislative leadership needed a little bit of a bump because they had different responsibilities than, the new legislator coming in. They also talked about presiding judges because the Supreme Court in Washington adopted a court rule laying out the responsibilities for presiding judges. So that was kind of this wasn't anything that was directed by the legislature. The legislature came in and recommended, and I just pulled those two out. They do have minority leaders, and if any of you are interested in that, it's on their website, or I can provide it to you. But the Attorney General in 1987, salary was $63,800. In 2008, it's $151,718. And the Secretary of State was $46,000, and it's now $117. And there have been no attempts at public referendums to overturn these salary recommendations. So I want to talk about some added benefits or some unintended consequences of this process. I think it's improved interbranch relations because now we can talk about the substance of the issues and the policies before the legislature and not be seen that every time the judges come across the parking lot or into the legislative building, it's for pensions or compensation or salaries. Totally has taken that issue off the table and refocused it onto the work of the people. It's not just about us. It's increased the respect that both branches have. Also, it's eliminated these big double-digit salary increases. Unless there was some major change, I think I was talking to the Secretary of State here, and he has a responsibility for managing the lottery. Well, that's in the executive branch in Washington State. I would assume if they moved that to the Attorney General, that this commission might say this is a major added responsibility. But you see, it's more like what you would do in salary setting in a professional human resources way. What has changed? What has changed? And the budget impact. As legislators, thinking about the budget implications, it's much easier to have some reliable, foreseeable impact of salaries rather than all of a sudden you've got this, major 30% increase that you got to figure out how to balance. One of the other ones that was unexpected was it increased diversity because all of a sudden people, and this was testimony that was received in some of the public hearings, that because the salaries were so low, some people couldn't afford to take that time off from their jobs, like people who were more independently wealthy or who had more time to complete a career. And some acknowledgement, they really weigh the legislative positions in Washington State at 70% of full time. And and I know as well as some of you do that it's more like 110% of full-time, because I think like the other branches of government, there's a lot of after-hours work required by the legislature. And then I want to talk about public trust and confidence just for a minute. I think it has created a truly transparent process. You know, why are these decisions made? What was considered in making them? And it has taught the public through these citizen members about the complexity of what you do. As you recall, I talked about that appreciation for public office is not coded into a voter's DNA. It has to be constantly educated. And I think these citizen members on this commission have taken that responsibility and embraced it. So the commission, once again, was established to evaluate the position, but voters still evaluate performance. And I couldn't close without giving you one final quote from the founding generation. And the quote I'm going to share for you was in a letter from Thomas Paine to Thomas Jefferson in 1800. I'm not tired of working for nothing, but I can't afford it. Thank you.